one of the reasons we allow once in a while interviews is Piper is deep inside a project we'll talk about in a minute, and this definitely takes a lot of headspace to be on the red circle. So,
oh, yeah.
she's given a talk in the past, and let's start there. So you and I met about 3 years ago at a TEDx event. Imagine that. At Marion Correctional. And it was hosted by Healing Broken Circles, which is the nonprofit that runs all of the programs at Marion and started the TEDx there. And some things happened, and all of a sudden, the next thing we knew, this East Coast girl is now living in Victorian Village.
Yeah.
So tell us how that happened.
I definitely live in Ohio because of TEDx. There's no question about that. Yeah, I was invited to Ohio to come and participate in a TEDx event that was held in a prison, and to our knowledge, the first prison in the world that ever hosted a TEDx event. And I came because I was like, that's weird. I came also because I was invited by a fellow Smithy. I went to a women's college called Smith College, and while I was there, and ever since I left that place, I've been schooled like, when a woman asks you to do something, good and important, you do everything in your power to say yes, and if it's a Smithy, then you definitely say yes. So there was a Smithy involved with TEDx. And I was also curious, because I had never visited a men's state prison facility before. And when we think about the fact that America incarcerates more of its own people than any other nation in the world, any society in human history, and we think about where the majority of those prisoners are, they are in state prison systems and men's state prison systems or local jails. So I thought it was important to sort of take that opportunity to go see that kind of a place. And I was astounded. It was actually the first TEDx I'd ever attended. You've been to Marion Correctional. It's a little different than this vibe, but not entirely. And the really amazing thing about that TEDx program at Marion is that it was a completely grassroots, ground-up thing. Some of the guys who worked in the computer lab there with Healing Broken Circles, they had the workers had downloaded, Brian Stevenson's TED Talks and other TED Talks for those guys to watch, and they were like, we could do that. Can we do that? And the warden at that time is the kind of guy who was like, if you can figure out how to do it, do it. And that's really profoundly unusual in a correctional setting. So I was really blown away by the things that I saw and experienced while I was there, the people I met, and I kept on thinking about that place and about that experience after I left Ohio. And, I was like, why is the warden like that? What are the guys doing right now? I kept thinking about it. I came back to speak at The Ohio State University, and I took that opportunity to go back for another visit. And over time, I just was really, really curious. So yeah, TEDx brought me here ultimately because I made an offer to that warden and also to the warden, Ronnie Burks, over at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville. I said, what if I come teach a writing class here in Ohio? And they were really receptive to that. And Gary Moore at the Ohio Department of Corrections was in favor and supportive, and that's really tremendous. And that's why I'm here. Yeah, Ohio.
So, and 3 years later, awesome. So, let's just talk about the classes. Actually, in fact, you left a class early today to be here with us. So thank you for doing that.
Straight from Marysville, yep.
So tell us what you're teaching.
So I teach, I guess I could teach some other things, but the only practical thing, I couldn't teach a fiction class. I don't actually know how to write fiction. I teach a narrative nonfiction writing class. So, some people might describe it as a memoir class. We sort of expand in a couple of extra directions above and beyond the classic memoir function. But my students are writing true stories drawn from their own lives, from the things that they've experienced, from the things that they've witnessed. We conduct the same class in the men's and women's facility. The first year that I was here, we spent reading 22 books that are grounded in some way in questions around mass incarceration. So books by people who had been incarcerated, people who had worked in prisons and jails. You know, there's an amazing book by a prison librarian. There's a wonderful book called New Jack about working as a correctional officer. We read those books. Books ground, some of the issues that circle around mass incarceration, like mental health issues or substance use disorder. But those 22 books we worked through because I felt that one way or another, my students would be able to tap into the experiences that those people were sharing and relate them back to their own experiences in ways that might be quite direct or at least observational. And I hoped that the experience of reading those narratives would also be inspiring, in terms of my students feeling like, hey, if that person did it, I can do it too. We read a book called Cooked by Jeff Henderson, who was a crack dealer once and is now a celebrity chef, and in between spent some time in federal prison. And he's a great example of someone with a really interesting and I would say important story to tell, who was not sort of educated in a typical way, and who yet, had this story to tell and was able to tell it. And I wanted my students to be inspired to tell their own stories because I think they're really important. My students have astonishing stories, as you can imagine. Like people, what we always talk about with story structure is that stories need conflict in order to really grab and hold our attentions. Certainly my students have had a lot of conflict in their lives,
yes.
And sometimes at this very moment do.
So let me just jump in there because I want to make sure we get to this one question about your students. So Piper's in a unique situation where she's teaching men on Fridays, women on Fridays, and men on Mondays. Very few teachers teach both genders in solitary, meaning like you're only teaching one and then the other. If you teach at a girls' school, you're only teaching girls. So what's the biggest difference between teaching those two different genders as they are together?
There are some very marked differences, and then there are some less marked, there are some similarities. I, again, went to a women's college, so not only am I very at home in a funny way at Marysville in terms of having had the experience of being incarcerated.
Smith, Marysville, Smith.
But also that sort of, a classroom setting, which is all women, is also very familiar to me. We teach the classical narrative structure in class, which means you identify a protagonist, you set them in motion in some way, you establish some sort of desire on their part. I always say you identify your protagonist, you get them up a tree, you throw rocks at them, and then somehow they get down out of the tree. And that's the story.
And they save the cat.
Well, maybe, or they fall out and break their neck. I mean, a story can have a tragic ending, it can have a happy ending. But we teach that classical, hero's journey protagonist. It's, something that is in almost every childhood storybook you ever read, almost every movie, might follow that process. You could critique the choice to teach it that way, but we knew that we'd be able to tap into what our students already knew from mass media and every other story. So the men really took like fish to water to that hero's journey. They might have been depicted as villains at other times in their life, or even at this moment in life when they're in prison, but they had no trouble thinking about themselves as the hero of the story. Funny.
And the women?
And the women, it took more coaxing, prodding, promising, cajoling, to move them to a place where they really thought about their own perspective driving the action of the story. And that is, of course, reflected in, the nature of the lives of the women who end up in the criminal justice system. Overwhelmingly victims of sexual abuse or other physical abuse. 80 to 90% of women and girls who end up in the system, that's true. disproportionate suffering of mental health problems or substance use disorder. So I think that's one of the reasons that it's so important for my students to have the opportunity to think about themselves as the protagonist and to think about themselves as having a whole set of desires and choices that drive the action of the story. I think that's important in reflection about what your life has been up to this point and also what your life is going to be going forward.
And is there anything that they all write about? Is there any one thing that you see consistent?
There are some through lines that come through. Guns come up in a number of the stories from both the men's and the women's class in fascinating ways sometimes, and terrifying ways. But the number one topic across both classes is people's mothers. Yeah. And I am a mother now. I am the mother of a relatively young child. I am a memoirist. I am nervous. Far and away, number one topic.
So one of the things you're doing is the reason that we allowed you not to have to give a talk. She's actually in the middle of writing her second book.
True that. Yeah. So.
I know she has a deadline, and we're not running out of time, but I want to get to a few more things. The last time you were in prison, you didn't know you were writing a book. Mm-hmm. And now that you are working in prison, you're writing a book. You want to just tell us what the books are, because there's actually two.
Yeah, so my students have been working so hard, and they do tremendous work. I've had some exceptionally talented writers in my classes. So we will, in the future, publish an anthology, a collection of the best writing from the classes. Yeah, which is great. And I am also writing about this process, about, just returning to prison, about what it's like to pull this kind of a group together, and how fascinating they are, and why they're so important to me, and why I think they're so important to everybody else too.
Awesome. So I know it's on the mind of many audience members. Did you expect the book to be such a hit show when you wrote it?
I always say that every writer has to fantasize success, whatever success looks like to them, because otherwise you would never, ever finish. I personally find the process of writing excruciating. Some people, I guess, may find it pleasurable, but it's, I know when I'm having trouble actually, when I'm literally jumping out of my seat, that I'm on the right track. But I think every writer has to fantasize some kind of success, whatever it is, whatever that means. You want to win a National Book Award, I guess that's what you fantasize about. But I'm very, very grateful that that very creative, provocative, talented, diverse people wanted to participate in that adaptation of the book. It's a fascinating process. I'm very, very fortunate.
Are you still involved in it?
I'm a consultant on the show. Actually, I was just emailing today with we're deep into shooting season 6.
Woohoo!
And
for those of you who are fans.
Yeah, indeed. And
any spoilers you want to?
The threats, you can't even imagine what they would do to me.
But you know where.
I do. I read scripts and I answer questions, and if I can't answer a question, then I find somebody who can. So I'm like, I didn't rob any banks, but I know someone who did.
So it would not be fair to have this conversation without digging into a few issues of real seriousness in our community right now. There's been a lot of conversation about victimizations not being reported in the last few weeks, but the rates of violent victimizations are probably even more startling. And what I found was from 2005 to 2010, 59% of all violent victimizations were not reported. So help us understand what's happening.
Yeah, not reported at all. right? And actually, when you drill down on some of those numbers from that period, which is pretty recent, 29% of people who were seriously harmed, gunshot wounds, stab wounds, broken bones, did not report that to the police, right? So if you look at those numbers, somebody who was robbed at gunpoint or, harmed in some other way, sexually assaulted, the choice not to trust the system, not to trust police, prosecutors, judges, to do the right thing, to be able to deliver on the promise of justice, has to concern us all, because that is a lot of harmed people walking around in the community, dealing with trauma, dealing with pain on their own, right? When we think about substance use disorder and mental health problems, those things are directly connected to trauma. And so the stakes of having a criminal justice system that so many people do not trust are very high for all of us, even those of us who are fortunate enough perhaps not to have been harmed, not to have been victimized. We all live together. I think people don't know how serious this trust problem is, even though we all see and watch with horror sometimes viral videos of Philandro Castile being killed by a Minneapolis police officer in front of his girlfriend and their 4-year-old child. This was a beloved school worker who was killed at a traffic stop. And that's a story that has far too many similar stories going on there. We invest an enormous amount of power in police, in prosecutors, in judges, in all of the law enforcement actors who work in the system. They wield an enormous, enormous amount of power over other people's lives. And when we can't trust either those individuals or those systems, the consequences for all of us are very serious, and I think we see that reflected in those numbers. So many people who are victimized who don't trust the system enough to seek justice, healing, or safety via those avenues. It must concern us. And the flip side is that what we find increasingly is that it's harder and harder to hold those players accountable, right? It's hard to hold police accountable. It's hard to hold prosecutors accountable. I started to make a list backstage, and I was like, this list is too long. People are just gonna glaze over. But there is a very lengthy, disturbing list of police misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct that goes without accountability. My students are being held accountable in very serious ways. The United States has the most punitive criminal legal system of all Western democracies. So you can check that box. We're very serious about punishment in this country, and yet we're not that serious about accountability. And so we see a real asymmetry when it comes to trust.
So when you were in prison for a year, and as reflected in your book, trust was a pretty significant theme, at least in the beginning.
Yeah.
Who can I trust? Can I trust myself to say the right things? Can I trust the food I'm eating? Right. Tell us how you ultimately came to trusting that environment while you were there.
Yeah, trust is really about finding your own true north, like having some trust in yourself to make the right call. Also, trusting yourself to learn from making the wrong call, right? In other words, you learn more from your failures. That's my 6-word memoir. You learn more from your, failures. And you know, interrogating your own failures is one of the ways that you learn how to trust yourself, I think. You know, acknowledging, taking responsibility for your failures, but also sort of interrogating them. How can I do better? And I think when you have that kind of solid ground to stand on, then you can make good decisions about others. And, you know, we are all connected to one another. That is the thing that was so apparent to me right from the jump. Even, you know, my first day incarcerated, you know, I didn't know who I could trust or who I couldn't trust, but I knew that I had to find someone who I could trust. You can't navigate this life disconnected from others. You have to be able to forge those bonds of trust, make yourself vulnerable, honor other people's vulnerability. And that's what starts to forge those bonds when we're kind in the face of vulnerability and when we're brave enough to display it ourselves. Yeah.
So when we go in to interrogate our failures, we'll think of you.
Good. Be gentle with yourselves, though. Yeah.
Piper, thank you so much for joining us at
Oh,
TEDx, and
of
thank you all for
course.
being a great
Hi, thank
audience.
you.